if you're going to encourage any status arms race, if that's what it truly was, and actually it'd be interesting to hear your take on that, then you'd want it to represent something higher. What do you think the elites of the time were driven by, apart from wanting to have the most the most impressive cathedral that sits in the center of their city or town?
What do I think the drivers were? Is that yeah. So interesting, really. The drivers are, well, we could go down many routes for this. So of course, there was this sort of theory that you had to save your soul, essentially, posthumously. So once you were dead, this is why we get the sort of great chantry chapels in cathedrals, the sort of mini cathedrals in and of themselves, where you have a monument to your dead body, which you might have created during your lifetime, and an effigy of yourself, and then sort of enclosed in this little box, if you will, but this beautifully designed box within a cathedral. And you would have an altar within it, and you would have a priest saying souls masses for the dead, for your soul once you had died. The more money you had, obviously, the more masses could be said for your soul. And so it's to ensure, obviously, you get through purgatory to heaven. So that really is the crux of much of this architecture. It's sort of representation, firstly, of the heaven on earth. But then on a sort of, that's the macro scale, really. This is literally the book of Revelation 21 to 22 is what a cathedral is, representation of heaven on earth. But in the micro scale, when people were commissioning and patronizing this work, if they wanted a chantry chapel, etc., it's to get their soul through purgatory to heaven. So that's a really important part of it. At the same time, let's be perfectly honest, this was also about vying for one's space and showing off one's wealth. And the more money you spent on it, the greater the building was, of course, the more elaborate it was. But at the same time, the more you've just proved that, or tried to prove that all your money is going towards heaven, all your money is going towards, the church. But also, it's a huge status symbol, let's be perfectly honest, which is why we get these such grand monuments, etc., or these great big stained glass windows patronized by one single person. So there are many different reasons and theories behind this, but it was very much an arms race between one cathedral and another, just trying to outdo one another. And this is why, as well, we get this sort of race for saints as well. So ideally, you had to have relics within your altar to have a sanctified church. This goes back to the 9th century, and Charlemagne, who said that you needed these relics to sanctify your church. But what this also meant was, if you had the body of a saint within your church, you had a reason for pilgrims. You had a reason for visitors to come to your church. And what happened when people would come to your saint? They would worship at them. They would hope for a cure or a miracle that the saint would endow, and then they would give an offering in return, in the hopes that they would fulfill their wish. And as a result, this essentially built and developed and altered and augmented the great cathedrals. So it was this great big sort of they were fundraising dynamos, let's be perfectly honest. There was this great big sort of profitability behind it all. So there's just so many different reasons for why we have these great edifices today.
Well, even when they were driven by status, the happy byproducts that we have today, and it took me much longer in life to start to appreciate these buildings and what they represent. But whilst they may have been built for trying to help the benefactor get to heaven, I know the first time I started to take proper notice inside of a church was inside Rosslyn Chapel, and I ended up there before I knew it became famous for Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code.
Yes.
And I remember I remember for the first time spotting that there were whole scenes of the Bible just chiseled into the stone. So it wasn't scriptural, it was depicted, seeing the dance of death and the 7 deadly sins. Yep. And I was like, oh wow, this is what these places are for, besides worship. And the tourism aspect you're talking about, or at least implying, I've had a real recent experience of that. I walked the Camino de Santiago, And I did it in two parts. First half last year, beginning in the French Pyrenees and ending around Burgos, and then finishing from there this year into Santiago. And even though you do get a sense that there's lots of money being made along the way, there's also something else about it having been walked for so long by so many different people and for so many different reasons, and knowing that you walk in those same steps and knowing that you're oriented towards something else. I guess when I speak to people about it, lots of people, because we're moderns, they go, "Oh, how was your long distance walk?" But a pilgrimage is a different thing, right? You orient yourself towards something beyond yourself, something higher, and there's lots of things going on internally. So it's actually interesting that so much of this stuff may have been raised above the ground for different reasons, status, money, whatever. But the benefits to all of us, should we choose to engage in it, and the impact it's had on actually creating a European civilization is huge.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we wouldn't really have some of our greatest sort of settlements, cities, towns, if it weren't for the cathedrals. You know, the towns, the cities developed around these great big temples to God. So absolutely that. And you're right, the sort of the benefits that come with it, particularly if we're talking about pilgrimage. I mean, you have so many cathedrals, you have so many churches, sites that are linked just as a result and even exist as a result of pilgrimage, because people were trying to get from A to B and were worshipping along the way. So, I mean, we could talk endlessly about the reasons behind these, but many of the reasons that these great churches were built for still provide those, outlets and reasons and functions today. And I think we often think, for example, that walking into a church, one must be very somber and very quiet, and it's all about worship. But that's actually not the case. It was never the case. In the medieval era, the nave would have been filled with socializing. There were people, sort of wine tastings, if you will, in the medieval sense, dating, that would be the place you would probably meet your partner. Dogfighting, cockfighting, all of this happened within the nave of a cathedral. It was the sort of community hub. And I suppose sometimes some churches still are, but it was very much that. It was a place of secular, and I mean that in terms of the non-religious sense, but it was a secular sort of area too, rather than just solely reserved for spiritual and religious functions. And I think that's just as important. And you mentioned the sort of artistic architectural aspects, and you can see them depicted, across the walls, across the stained glass. But within that too, you can also see very sort of humanistic allegorical images. I can think, for example, of the pilgrimage window at York Minster down the north aisle, the nave's north aisle. And although the window there is primarily for, it is a biblical scene, but all around the marginalia, so that the border of it is a depiction of, for example, the Virgin's funeral. And this isn't a sort of allegorical story, but it's depicted through monkeys. And so it's called, the Virgin's funeral through, what's it called? Monkey's funeral, I think, is what the window is technically referred to as. And so the bier is held up by all these monkeys. And what it's also doing is mocking doctors of physic. And so you've got monkeys holding vials of urine and things like that. So my point being, though, that there are funny images. We can get on to naughty images. We see those all over churches too. But it is about the fact that this is about the people. This is about those who are worshiping in it. And it's not just that sort of very theological, doctrinal, biblical sense by any means. All different things going on.